Today in the Catholic Mass series, we look at a question that sparks heated debate in traditional circles. Why does the SSPX use the 1962 Missal? Father Palko walks us through the history of liturgical change, from Quo Primum in 1570 all the way up to the turbulent 1960s, and explains the Society's principled decision to adhere to the final pre-Novus Ordo edition. Along the way, we clarify myths about Quo Primum, address the role of Annibale Bugnini, and explore why change is not inherently bad, as long as it doesn't endanger the faith. This episode lays the groundwork for a deeper dive into the Holy Week reforms on our next episode. In the meantime, on sspxpodcast.com/mass, you'll be able to find all of these episodes, videos, and resources. This is free to listen to, but please do consider a one-time or a small monthly recurring donation, no matter which Holy Week you prefer. So now let's join Father Ian Andrew Palko for episode number 45 of our Catholic Mass series, Why the SSPX Uses the 1962 Missal. Father Palko, great to have you back for another episode of the Catholic Mass series. How are you?
I'm doing pretty well, Andrew. Good to be back. And it's been a little while, but it's been some really interesting things in the Mass series and some questions with Father in the meantime. So we priests actually listen to, I don't listen to my own stuff. That would be a little, little weird. But when I drive or something like that, I'll oftentimes pop on pop on the podcast, listen to it. It can be a great resource even for us.
Well, that's great. I'm glad to hear even someone as brilliant, intelligent, well-versed
as Father Robinson.
As Father Robinson.
can inform even Father Palko.
Well, today we're going to be doing a couple episodes with you. This week we're going to be talking about broadly why the SSPX uses the 1962 Missal for the Mass. It's kind of a hot button topic that we teased last time you were with us. And then next week, we're going to be diving a little bit deeper into why not the pre-55 Holy Week. Why does the SSPX use the Reformed Holy Week? So this is kind of a two-part episode, right? Right.
And in fact, that's initially when we were talking about it, we were looking at perhaps doing just something on the Holy Week episode. And I thought since I thought that would be a really interesting one to do. And then when you were going over the Missal and how to use it, the whole topic of the 1962 versus other ones came up. So it seemed we kind of sell ourselves short if we didn't look at that
Sure.
part of it too.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess let's just start with some of the basic kind of guidelines. Always like to start with, all right, here's one end of the spectrum. Here's the other end of the spectrum. One end of the spectrum that we can start with, because we just finished talking about the new Mass with 3 or 4 episodes on why the SSPX, why it's such a strong opinion of the SSPX to not use or to not say the new Mass. But I guess we start with one end of the spectrum, which is the 1969, the Novus Ordo Missae, that the new Mass. That is not what we use.
Correct. Yeah. And we use something anterior to that. We use what effectively we'll say is the last of the official typical editions. There's something called the Editio Typica. The typical edition is the official edition that is published by the Holy See itself for use in the Latin Church. And so that's the last one that was there before the Novus Ordo. In fact, was issued in late 62, early 1963 are some of the publications. That's the one that added St. Joseph to the canon. John the 23rd did that just before the issuance of the Missal. So that was the last one. And because we're not sedevacantists, we accept that was a legitimate change. And the last edition, official edition, before the Novus Ordo, 1969, is what we would use. And just to give sort of a summary of what we'll talk about here, I think that's always useful. Sometimes at the beginning, we start talking through a podcast and we're going to get to this question. And, 30 minutes in, 50 minutes in, we finally answer the question, which we want the details. But we effectively, because we're not sedevacantists, we use the last official one, the last official editions before the Novus Ordo. And we don't use any of those transitory things that happened during the 1960s because those never were part of an official edition. Those were just changes, sometimes local. Some places did it different ways, just permissions that were an attempt to kind of transition towards the Novus Ordo. None of them really affect or a matter of the faith, but because they never became an issue, while at the beginning of the society, sometimes it was used, once the society sort of settled on, we're going to do something consistent everywhere, let's just go with the last official edition before the 1969 Novus Ordo there. And effectively, that's because we don't get to do what we please. We have to do what the church wants us to do. And in the face of a situation where we can't accept the Novus Ordo, well, we go back to what we had right beforehand.
Sure.
So that's just, I guess you could say, the 30,000 foot view summary of what I'll probably talk about, hopefully, because we're at the beginning of the episode. we don't know how that'll all go, but that's effectively the summary that I kind of would like to add some meat to that skeleton going through.
Sure. Well, that makes sense. Another thing that I think is good for us to do in this episode is to do a brief recap or a brief understanding to kind of recap some of the episodes we did, like looking at the sheet here, like episodes 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, when we were talking about the history of the Mass. Mm-hmm. And there's this idea, you have it in the notes that you gave me that we're both kind of working on. We have this idea that the Roman liturgy was this unchanging, universal thing that had no updates for hundreds, even thousands of years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really just a myth. And we could say substantially it doesn't change. The essentials are there from the time of the apostles and are passed down. And you see those essentials in all the various different kinds of rites, all the various Western rites, all the various Eastern rites. The essential elements are there. Those don't appreciably change. But there's plenty of other things that do. So the myth that the Roman liturgy was some universal, unchanging bulwark since the time of St. Gregory the Great just really isn't true. In fact, up really until the Council of Trent in the early to mid 1500s, remember it spans over a number of years and many different sessions, but the one on the Mass particularly is around the time of 1570. That's the issuance of Quo Primum. At that point in time, now there's some uniformity, but not across the board. But before that point in time, there were a lot of different versions of the Roman Rite throughout the church, all substantially the same, but there was really just little variations. And we would perhaps, looking at the Mass today, consider some of those variations quite significant. Especially when we have people who might say, you can't change the canon, you can't add St. Joseph, you have to do it this way. What about this prayer? You can't change that word. No, there were plenty of things that were getting changed. A good resource on that, aside from the various history of the Mass that we talked about here, is Father Adrian Fortescue's the Mass, a study of the Roman liturgy. That one right there.
That one. It's a great one.
It's a very good book, and he goes into a lot of the history there of how the liturgy developed, and it's really kind of an interesting thing to see, how it probably differs a lot from our understanding of how these things worked. I ended up writing an article more or less based off of some of the things that Father Fortescue talks about for the first 6 centuries back in May, June of 2023 in the Angelus. But even what we could say is that St. Gregory the Great, so this is the beginning of the 6th century, so the end of the 5th century, beginning of the 6th century. He's around that time. And by that point in time, the canon is more or less fixed. But even then, after that point in time, and this happened even after 1570 in Quo Primum, the Communicantes and the Nobis Quoque was where we add saints' names. Various other saints, local saints, were being named there. So even the canon was changing at that point in time there. Sometimes we would even add the king and the emperor. There's the pro regis or pro rege, sorry. We talk about the Pope. We talk about the local bishop. Some places they would add the king, in fact. So there were a lot of changes at that point in time. The Agnus Dei, it's not there in St. Gregory the Great's time. It didn't come until the 7th century. The elevation of the host and the chalice is 12th century, not universal to the end of the 13th century. Carthusians still don't do that, actually. So despite the fact that they took the Roman rite from us, modified various things. Yeah. And then the genuflection that we're very used to before the consecration and after the consecration aren't even universal until the 16th century. Mm-hmm. So we see that there is a substantial bulwark there, but it's not something that the changes are not something that we should be afraid of in and of themselves. Right. We'll maybe develop that a little bit. But even just to make the point here, today, if one of the Dominican priests comes, he's going to say the Dominican rite. And we see this is actually more or less a Gallican version of the Roman rite from the 13th century. The prayers at the foot of the altar are entirely different. The chalice is prepared at the beginning of the Mass, or the offertory looks sparse in comparison. A lot of the prayers that we highlight as very sacrificial are just completely gone because all that's prepared beforehand. The Roman canon is used, but the priest holds his hands differently. And even just in the Roman rite itself, the same set of prayers were said in various places, but some variations there. So Quo Primum, we're all very familiar with that, I would imagine, if we listen to the podcast, if we're familiar with the traditionalist movement. That Quo Primum essentially provides a version of the Missal that was used by the Curia at Rome, and then that's given out. But even then, as much of a bulwark as that is, 40 years later, Clement the Eighth is messing with the Mass. He's making textual changes to it, but for good reasons. This is Cum Sanctissimum in 1604. The change here, you're familiar probably with the absolution that the priest recites: Indulgentiam, absolutium, remissionem, peccatorum nostrorum. May the Lord give you indulgence and remit all of your sins. Well, in the 1570 text, Quo Primum, it uses omnium peccatorum, all of your sins. And because that's considered not to actually absolve all of your sins, that's what confession is for. Omnium is taken out in 1604 because it's confusing. People were thinking, I don't have to go to confession. Well, we ought to fix that. The Dirigatur Domine that we say incensing the altar used to be said every time we incense the altar. Now it is only said at the offertory from 1604 on. Haec quotius cumque during the elevation was said actually during the elevation, not beforehand. And in fact, I saw this mistake once at the seminary. A priest singing the blessing at the end, and it's only a bishop that does that. We can make these little mistakes, right? So, but in fact, in the 1570 Missal, that's exactly what the priest would do. He would bless just like a bishop, the three blessings. So,
interesting.
Yeah. And there were some publisher that changed out the Vulgate text for the old Latin texts that were still there. So 40 years after Quo Primum, there's changes. It's not as if this thing is, again, a bulwark even at that point in time.
Interesting. Any other changes that happened shortly after? Yeah.
Well, plenty. So now we're 70 years afterward. This is Clement had made revisions. And now Urban VIII is going to revise the breviary hymns. It's kind of unfortunate because he takes these Jesuit scholars in Latin who want to have very classically sounding hymns, and so they revise all the hymns, and a lot of the polyphonic responsories and things like that now can't be used. But in the Mass, he rewords rubrics to make things more clear. He restores the Vulgate where the old Latin had been taken out, etc. So it's opposite of what Clement VIII did. And then, of course, there's St. Pius X himself. He begins what is supposed to be a general liturgical reform that then gets sort of diverted from its purpose during the Second Vatican Council and afterward. But it starts with St. Pius X, and we've talked a lot about him with regard to sacred music, participation in the liturgy. He did a massive reform of the breviary, in fact. So remember, that's still part of the liturgy. Right. I mean, the liturgy is this whole thing, and it's just My point here is to show that there's a lot of changes that are happening. It's not as if this whole thing was just a bulwark. There's another decree, just like Quo Primum, that St. Pius V issues about the breviary that sounds very similar in its wording, and yet St. Pius X used the same kind of language to institute a new breviary. And it was quite unprecedented. There's a good article from 2003 in the Angelus on the reform of the breviary there. What St. Pius X does is he completely rearranges the whole Psalter, all the Psalms. So all 150 are normally said during the week. But Matins turns from 18 Psalms on a Sunday to 9. 18 Psalms is a lot to say, by the way.
Yeah.
They were never partial Psalms. Sometimes if you're familiar with like Compline or something like that, you'll see that a Psalm was split over parts. That didn't happen until St. Pius X. Beforehand, with the exception of one, Psalm 118, which is in 11 parts, and it's throughout the day, starting with prime all the way to noon, all the minor hours. Feast days would have 9 Psalms, and ferias would have 12 Psalms. And the reason for this is because throughout the weekdays, all of the minor hours were Psalm 118. And so you needed to make up those Psalms somewhere else. So you fit them in on all these extra days. And that's the reason that in 1904, St. Pius X looks at the problem here and says, well, there's only 85 days in the year where the weekday Psalms are even used. So that's a huge, the traditional idea was that the entire Psalter is prayed during the week. And it's certainly not doing that. There is no single week in the liturgical year in the time of St. Pius X until his reforms where you would say all 150 Psalms. It just would not happen. It simply could not happen because of the way the calendar and the feasts were there. There are 280 feast days that would disrupt that whole cycle.
Right.
So what did he change? Well, Matins is always now going to be 9 Psalms, or the parts of them. Sunday, you keep Psalm 118 for the minor hours on major feasts as well. But then he took the rest of the Psalter and he redistributed it throughout the week. And the idea being that most weeks, you're going to say all 150 Psalms like they did in the early church. The only difficulty here is that it's a significant departure from tradition. Yeah. And some people will even argue this is like, this is the opening Pandora's box. And are we going to really accuse St. Pius X of being a modernist?
Right.
And especially in liturgy. Yeah. So what the Council of Trent was really doing here, in fact, is trying to stop local modifications of the liturgy, the Mass and the breviary, without those changes first being approved by the Holy See. And in the context, it makes a lot of historical sense. What are the Protestants doing? It's all about me, myself, and I. It's how I worship. It's how I do things. Whereas the church is saying, no, it's how the church does things. And so instead of just letting everybody and anybody, a Protestant or a Protestant favoring bishop or something like that, let people do whatever they want and sort of start to undermine the Catholic spirit of the Mass. No, we're going to, at the highest level, now there's been enough organic development. There still will be, but it's always going to be approved. And it's going to be approved by the Holy See. So we're reserving to ourselves now, the Pope are saying, we're reserving to ourselves now the practical regulation of the liturgy. It's for the Pope to do this, to, again, remove the Protestant influence or the possibility of that in something so important to the church.
Is it fair to say that up until 1570, up until Quo Primum, there was really no issue, broadly speaking? There were of course some scandals. There were some masses being written and said that were improper. But for the most part, this wasn't really an issue. It was more we really need to hammer down and make sure that there is no chance of heresy or any sort of Protestant favoritism coming through the Missal. And so this is now ours, the Holy See, because it's too, like you said, I'm kind of repeating what you said, but this is too important for a local bishop to decide. It's not a doctrinal issue. Yes, the local bishop does have latitude and does, by virtue of his office, have latitude to organize, to change the liturgy in that place. But hey, things have gotten so bad, we got to pull that back.
Yeah, and it wasn't that you couldn't get those changes, right? So even after this point in time, there was even, in traditional times, the vernacular being allowed to be used in certain missionary areas.
Sure.
Right? The local bishop or the superior, they could ask these permissions from the Holy See to deviate from the standard. And oftentimes they were given for a good reason. But it was for the Holy See to make these decisions. It wasn't for the local bishop, sui juris, to do it himself.
Okay.
And so he could regulate the liturgy in his diocese to a great degree, but the regulation of the whole of the liturgy is now kind of pulled back to the Holy See. It's centralized, as it were. And just as you mentioned, it's not a matter of doctrine. It's just a practical disciplinary measure, right? And we know that that's the case because before 1570, the rites were being changed and there was no objection to them on the level of doctrine. So it's, in fact, afterward, the popes continue to make changes, adding feasts. Benedict XV adds the preface for the dead and the preface of St. Joseph, something that St. Pius X was wanting to do but never got to do before he passed away. And, of course, St. Joseph's name's added to the canon in 1962. That idea was already requested under before St. Pius X's time, was considered during the time of St. Pius X, and finally happened a lot later. In fact, I think that's a great example of how the liturgy is supposed to change. It's not so a few ideas here and there, they're considered, they're put aside for a little while. And unless there's something absolutely immediate, it may take 50 years. It may take 100 years for some of these changes to slowly and organically happen, even if they're approved at the highest level. That's how the church normally works. And when it is just a committee that says, here you go, rubber stamp this thing, we can run into some problems.
Right. Right. And that's exactly what we saw with the last few episodes of a complete invention of a new rite of the Mass.
And materially, certain aspects may look like the traditional way, but it's really whole cloth and new. That's a really important point to make there. But I think the overarching important point here, and being a sort of coming to tradition myself in college, and finding about a lot of these arguments about Quo Primum, how you couldn't change this and like that. I think oftentimes early along when we're not versed in things traditional, and maybe the benefit of these podcasts is to help us to have a broader perspective. It was as if, Quo Primum, you couldn't change anything. And I think it's important to understand it's, as strong as the language sounds, it was never intended as some infallible decree, never permitting any change to the liturgy after 1570, as if it's set, and the popes never thought of that way. And in fact, no pope afterward felt that they were bound by that. So appealing to Quo Primum is a fairly weak argument in all of this. Fundamentally, it sort of misunderstands the nature of papal infallibility and authority. Right? Infallibility is it is a positive power in a certain sense, but it isn't a positive power to enact certain things. I think it's a positive power to make clear what we have to believe and do. It's a negative power in another sense, in which the faith were being protected from errors and from sometimes popes. The infallibility, in fact, sort of helps say, yep, the Pope can't do that. Even though he would want to bind you to do something evil, an evil Pope may want to do that, he actually can't. And the Holy Ghost will protect you. In fact, infallibility only applies when the Pope is trying to address the whole church. And one of the fundamental things about Quo Primum is it's about the Latin rite. It's not about the whole church. So it's strong language, and certainly we could say it sets a very high bar for what kinds of changes must be made. You can't just willy-nilly change things. It sets a good principle, but it doesn't set a line in the sand over which you can't cross. Yeah. And even though there are changes, they're infrequent and they're not major. And there's a great break of that whole principle and tradition precisely in the 1960s with the Concilium and then with the Novus Ordo. They break this, and not for a good intention, for ecumenical purposes, in order to reduce the nature of the Mass as far as its Catholicity.
Yeah. And that's a great point. When we see the changes, and I'm putting words in your mouth, so correct me if I'm wrong, but when we see changes that are made, whether they are in the 1969 new Mass or whether they are prior, it can help if also we look at what is the purpose behind it? What's the reason why?
Absolutely.
And like you said, with the new Mass, if the changes are, well, we need to make it more acceptable for non-Catholics, that gives you a clue right there that there might be a problem. And then you need to dig a little bit deeper.
Right.
But if you compare that with the change of adding St. Joseph to the canon, what was the reason for that? And actually, I don't know what the reason is, other than what I presume, which is to increase devotion to the foster father of our Lord. Well, that sounds like a pretty good reason. And that doesn't sound like a bad reason to make a change.
Yeah, and one of the reasons it started becoming something that was requested by bishops was, and this is under Leo the 13th, you have the Holy Family and devotion to the Holy Family. There wasn't really a great devotion to St. Joseph until the Middle Ages. And even then, it still starts growing finally until about the 19th century, when there is a great devotion to him, and he's a central figure in our Lord's life. And if you look at it, except for St. John the Baptist, there's nobody missing from that canon that wasn't a central figure in our Lord's life.
Yeah.
And then we have so many others of the Roman saints that are in there as well. Right. So all of the apostles, but closest to that is St. Joseph. And so certainly if he's the protector also of the church, aren't you going to be wanting to, invoke him, increase devotion to him? So, I mean, we could argue whether it's a prudent call, especially in the midst of liturgical changes and problems and things like that. But certainly there's nothing against the faith with that kind of a change. Whereas to remove elements or to minimize the Catholic appearance of a certain element, or allow an interpretation that's more ambiguous in order to, in order to please Protestants, or in order to remove objections or things like that. Yeah, it should show you right there that there's something wrong. Even if materially speaking, the change is not bad in and of itself, the motive is bad.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And the motive sets everything here.
Yeah, that's a great point. So what you're getting to is this idea that change is not bad. Good change is good. And the idea is that we need to be okay we need to not be scared of change, but look at the changes that are made and go and apply a litmus test of what's right, what's wrong to those changes.
Right. We don't want the stereotypical joke about traditional Catholics and changing a light bulb, right?
Right.
How many traditional Catholics does it take to change a light bulb? Change? Oh.
I like that one. That's good.
So,
right. It's true.
It is. I mean, it's, and for a good reason. We should be suspicious of change, and especially as traditional Catholics, and especially in a church that is seeming to change almost everything, where there's no principles behind it. Absolutely, we should be suspicious of changes. I mean, I am right now in Kansas City, Missouri. We are the show me state. I want to be shown why this is good or why this is bad, right? That's
sure.
In our blood here. It's change in and of itself is not the problem. It's the motive behind it, and it's what's being changed and the effect thereof. And so, in fact, the problem of choosing a missal, and this is sort of getting to the heart of the issue of the 1962 missal that we use, and rejecting the Novus Ordo isn't a rejection of the possibility of change. It's a rejection of the manner and the intention behind those changes. The Pope certainly has the power to change the liturgy and impose these rites on the church. Quo Primum and Divino Flatu, that's the breviary change of St. Pius X. These are obviously, the Pope has that power. And the power comes from God, obviously. The Pope's the earthly head of the church and can regulate those non-essential parts of the Mass as a disciplinary or a human law. And that's, I think, the most important thing here. If we want to have a good principle, when can change happen? When can't change happen? a legislator isn't just free to do whatever he feels like. I mean, think of what happens in our country here in the United States. The legislature passes a law. The law goes somehow against the higher law, the Constitution, and then a court comes in and says that's unconstitutional. It's not a valid law. So there are certain limits on that legislative power. And even the Pope, he's bound by certain things. He's bound obviously by divine law, but also good moral principles and the kinds of changes that he makes and the kinds of laws that he institutes. Bad laws aren't laws, even when a Pope issues them. So if we want to see this, I think we should look at somebody who's much smarter than Father Robinson or you or even me.
Even you.
Well, let's look at St. Thomas Aquinas.
Okay. Fair.
Yeah, fair enough. I'm just going to pilfer from him because he's quite sage in these things. Yeah. He's talking in the Prima Secundae, question 97, article 2. He's talking about law, customs, and disciplines, human law. Obviously, we're not talking about divine law. That doesn't change. But he has a really good general principle. Human law, he says, is rightly changed insofar as such change is conducive to the common good, because law actually is an ordinance of reason for the common good. So you can change these things. That's fine. But then he goes on and he extends this very simple principle, explaining why and when you change law. And he says, even if it produces something better, the very fact of changing a law harms the common good. So any change whatsoever always causes a harm. And he explains it this way. He says, the mere change of a law is prejudicial to the common good because custom, our habit in doing certain things, assists greatly in observing laws, seeing that what is done contrary to a general custom, even in slight manners, starts to become something that's serious. It's what he's explaining there. So when we change a law, the binding power of law itself is diminished. The authority is undermined in a certain way by the very fact of changing, and the fact that the habit that you have of following the law is disrupted. And so we shouldn't change any law or discipline or practice unless that's compensated for, not just something better happens. And I think that's the well-meaning people in the liturgical movement maybe forgot about that part of it. This is good. It helps more people come and understand the Mass. Great. But the very fact of changing things may introduce more changes. So maybe we have to be careful here. And maybe, good well-meaning people in the liturgical movement may have been thrown off by the forgetting of that principle. So we have to compensate either by there's an immediate need right now because there's some urgent case, or there's some even greater good to be had than the harm that is caused by this change. And so a pope certainly can change a discipline, and the liturgy is a discipline, but there's a danger there, and it has to be compensated for. So a change can be just, even if something seems superfluous. But I think Chesterton's principle about offense is a good one to remember here. You familiar?
I'm not.
Oh, he says, when you come upon offense, you may not understand why it's there, but you don't remove it until you understand why somebody put it there.
Okay.
Right? Just because you don't see the reason for something doesn't mean there's not a reason for something. So same thing with liturgy. Just because we have certain things that maybe don't make a whole lot of sense, or we don't understand where they came from, or we're not sure precisely what it's referring to. A perfect example towards the end of the canon, Perique Haec Omnia, is a prayer, the second one right before the end, where we make the sign of the cross there. Even Fortescue explains, he says, we're not exactly sure what this refers to. Haec Omnia, we're not exactly sure what that Haec Omnia are. Is it everything beforehand? Is it the species in front of us? Because it doesn't seem to really refer clearly to anything.
Right.
There's another one too when we're talking about at the Suscipe Sancti Trinitas during the offertory.
Yes.
And like these here.
Yep.
Which ones? The relics or the angels? The saints? We've lost the understanding of what exactly these refer to, but we don't remove them just because we don't understand them. That's the Chesterton principle of the fence. So
isn't there also? This is getting maybe too much in the weeds, but I think there's also a prayer after the consecration in the Roman Rite that doesn't exist after the consecration in any of the other rites in all the other rights that exist beforehand. And it's kind of a weird, and someone will have to correct me or point it out in the comments where I have it wrong or right. I'm not sure, but there is a prayer that exists after the consecration that's like,
you might be referring to the Unde et Memories, the one that's right afterward.
Yes.
I don't know if it doesn't exist, but there's certainly some critique, even in the liturgical movement, of some prayers that come after that seem to refer to something, the consecration going to happen.
Yes, that's what I'm referring to. Yeah. Okay. And it doesn't quite make sense to have it afterwards, but I guess to your point, same thing. Well, but it's there, and we better have a really good reason why we're going to either remove it or modify it or switch its position or something. And there's not that good of a reason to do it, so we leave it.
Right. Yeah. No, that's okay. Maybe even you could come up with a reason, but you're changing the very core of the Mass here. You're changing words that stand right next to the words of consecration.
Yep.
You better have the most, there better be a most severe reason, a most grave reason, or a real problem. Because again, that's I have a hard enough time now just trying to remember not to say Pope Francis's name during the canon. Right?
Yeah.
I finally, in the last couple of weeks, I've been able to go through without that hiccup, but it took a while. I mean, that's the effect of custom and habit. It's why we don't change things, We have to change popes. I know people die. That's fine. Yeah. I mean, but
guess what? All of Father Palko's masses have been invalid. I'm joking. Sorry. Bad joke.
Well, some people might argue that. So they aren't. But so there's that problem, the fence problem. There's also the Pandora box problem that I mentioned before. Once you start changing the liturgy, even if it's good, you're going to start setting up a problem for yourself. Whoa, hey, we found something else that maybe we should have changed before. Let's look at that one now. And that's especially problematic during what Pius XII intended in this, what he called a general liturgical reform that he started during the 1940s, which really St. Pius X wanted to do. And in fact, kind of goes back to Quo Primum itself. So the Pandora's box, we could easily tolerate more change. Once you start with one change, sometimes it's pretty easy to have yet another change after that. So in other words, the change has to be for the common good. Normally speaking, in normal times, the popes would be the ones to make that call. They have the grace of state to make these decisions. And if there's a failure in prudence there, in a serious enough manner, we do have the duty to object. And that's precisely what we're doing when we're saying no to the Novus Ordo and yes to the 1962. Right? The change has to be for the common good. Certainly any change that risks the diminution of our faith, makes the rites more ambiguous or less clearly an expression of the Catholic faith, or the state of motives aren't Catholic, humanism, for instance, then that change is really an abuse of the power to change the liturgy at that point in time. It's yes, the power exists, but the power exists not to abuse it, right? A father in a family certainly has a disciplinary power over his children. He doesn't just get to beat them because they didn't bring him a beer when he wanted a beer. Right? That would be an abuse of that power. They're not his slaves. They are supposed to obey out of love and various other things. Well, that's in a certain sense. When we have bad motives for the changes, and popes themselves are saying, "I want this," it's perfectly right to say, no, that's abusive of souls, really. And that's really the problem of the Novus Ordo in and of itself. It's abusive. It's abusive of souls and our faith. And that's why we can have a reaction to that, a principled reaction, which I'd argue is the society's reaction, understandably. A little biased on that one.
Slightly.
But the principled position is, okay, we can't accept this. We're going to suspend our assent to this because it certainly seems like it's an abuse of power. It's going to undermine our faith. So we're going to not accept that. We're going to suspend until the time where a pope who does have good principles, who isn't abusive, is going to sort that one out for us. We're not the authority, so we leave it to them. But a reflex principle in morality, when you don't have a solution to it, you withhold judgment, you stand back from it, and then you take what is safe. And what is safe is the last thing that the Holy See gave us in sane times, which was the 1962 Missal. And then you wait for the hierarchy to solve the problem. We don't solve it ourselves. The opposite position would be the personalist position, I would call it. And that's where, well, I can't accept that, so I'm just going to do whatever I feel like. I'm going to do what I feel like is the better right. And I think that's really why we accept the 62 and not anything else, because it's not about our preferences.
Yeah, it's a great argument, and it's an interesting kind of exercise in obedience to the liturgy, which, again, for those listening who are not part of or not a fan of the SSPX, I get how ironic that sounds for me to say obedience to the liturgy on an SSPX podcast.
Yeah.
Understand that. But Father, who was it? Father, I'm looking at my notes. Father Boyle, episode 36, we talked about the liturgical year. And he talked about the same sort of thing where we were recording it on the Feast of St. Mark, and that was superseded by the Friday in the octave of Easter, I think. And he was like, I don't get to celebrate the Mass of St. Mark today, regardless of whether or not I have a great devotion to him, because the church commands me, the liturgical calendar commands me to say this Mass. So I don't get to do it. And there's something freeing and beautiful about it, but there's also, it really reminds you as a priest and us as the faithful that it's not about us.
That's precisely it. And that's the problem, I would say, with a lot of people who, there are plenty of people who, for instance, would argue, I'll mention Holy Week here. I know we're going to do a whole episode on it because there's a lot there, and especially the history of it, which is really interesting. We use the quote unquote new Holy Week, but there's quite a crowd that wants to use the pre-56 Holy Week, the one that was from 55 and beforehand. They call themselves the Restorer of the 54. There's an argument on the year. The actual decree is in late 55, so it isn't actually applicable until 56. So in 55,
but the rhyme is really good.
Exactly. Yeah. Let's jive with the 55. That doesn't. It's not going to work that way. So 54 sounds great. Restore the 54. So I'll put it this way. I have a great sympathy for that, because if it were up to me, having grown up in college, I went to a chapel where an independent priest said the older Holy Week. And while the weird thing about times and all like that is a problem, the ceremonies actually, I think, make a lot more sense. So if it were up to me, I'd use that old Holy Week. Thank God it's not up to me.
Yeah.
Because if liturgy is about my preferences, if it's a personal preference that directs the liturgy, we're no better than the Novus Ordo. All liturgical abuses that happen in the Novus Ordo, the only difference is one seems to come from a traditional perspective and, is orthodox, but throws out the idea that the church a priest is meant to be formed by the liturgy, not to form the liturgy. And the faithful are the same way. So I'm very sympathetic to their arguments. And again, if it were up to me, it's not up to me. We're not supposed to mold the liturgy to fit us, in other words. And that's the problem in the Novus Ordo. You can do whatever you want. There's all of these options. And then, priests do all kinds of different things. Maybe they make it far more traditional, ad orientem, chant, incense, bells, various other things. Or they could just make it a liberal mess. I mean, going to a supposedly Catholic Jesuit college, more Jesuit than Catholic. There were some pretty terrible and awful things that I saw that I think helped me move towards tradition. And so you could go anyway. It's amorphous. That's, again, sort of the problem with the Novus Ordo is it's amorphous. It's a greater or lesser danger to the faith. It kind of depends on who's there, which priest is doing this, how orthodox is he. But I don't think we want to embrace that principle of, sui juris ad libitum. I do whatever I want according to my own law, my own ideas, my own rule, especially in the liturgy, even if it is to go back to something that is certainly beautiful, good, and the church has done for a long time, when that's not what the church insisted that we do. I think it's important to form ourselves to the church. Should we work perhaps towards a restoration of that from the right authorities? Sure. Perhaps that's a great idea. But I think you work with what you got to begin with, especially in the crisis in the church. We really shouldn't be operating on personalist principles, I don't think.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's what kind of got us in, not kind of, that's what got us into this mess in the first place.
Indeed.
Was all that. So the society has an objection to, well, several things that churchmen have done in the last 50, 60 years. Can we zoom out a little bit and take a look at how the society logically or what the principles are for the society to object to things like the new mass?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Archbishop Lefebvre himself was actually pretty clear in this. So he effectively says, when there's a matter of faith and morals, and you're commanded to do something that seems contrary to Catholic teaching or is going to endanger your faith, you just simply can't do that. You can't put your faith in danger. You can't compromise on matters of faith and morals. But when it's a matter of prudence, and that is to say faith and morals aren't put in danger, you actually have a duty to obey, right? And this is going back to the whole personalist idea. If it's not a matter of faith and morals, it is a matter of prudence. And St. Thomas Aquinas is going to explain the principle because Archbishop Lefebvre puts it this way in a 1983 letter, Superior General's letter. The basic principle, he says, of the society's thinking and action in this painful crisis in the church that it's going through is the principle taught by St. Thomas Aquinas in the Summa Theologica, that one may not oppose the authority of the church except in the case of imminent danger to the faith. And St. Thomas Aquinas is laying this out in the Secunda Secundae of his Summa, question 33, article 4, his response to the second objection. And he says it this way: one who is not an equal can reprove privately and respectfully. So my superior says something that seems off. I can pull him aside and say, I don't think that's right, Father. Respectfully speaking, I think that needs to be corrected. But I don't do that in front of everybody else.
Right.
But St. Thomas Aquinas goes on and says, it must be observed that if the faith were endangered, a subject ought to rebuke his prelate even publicly. Hence, Paul, who was Peter's subject, rebuked him in public on account of the imminent danger of scandal concerning the faith. And as the gloss, little side writing of Augustine says in Galatians 2:11, Peter gave an example to superiors that if at any time they should happen to stray from the straight path, they should not disdain to be reproved by their subjects. So superior doesn't usually get corrected, but if it's a matter of the faith, obviously first you try a private correction, but sometimes you have to speak up publicly. And this is the principle that Archbishop Lefebvre is basically trying to enunciate here. That is to say, there's a hierarchy of virtues, and obedience is part of justice. Mm-hmm. Justice is a moral virtue. And so if justice is not served by being obedient, in fact, we have to be just, and we may have to apparently disobey for justice sake. Yeah. But then obviously faith is even higher. Faith reaches directly to God. So if faith is put into danger, or if faith is compromised in some way, and really truly compromised in an objective manner, not just subjectively, then obviously disobedient. If it's for prudence, if for justice, if it's for these lower moral virtues, then certainly for something like the faith. So if the command, even if a pope, proffers some liturgical change that presents a real harm to our faith, there's a duty to resist it. And that's the principle of the society in objecting to the Novus Ordo. And it's also the principle of the society and why we choose the 1962 Missal itself, in fact.
Right.
And why and why we accept some of those changes that happen under Pius XII that may seem on some level to be tainted by certain things, because they're not aspects of the faith, even if perhaps, like, for instance, the changes in Holy Week, we may not like them. We may like them. I don't know. But whatever the case, we're not we're operating in this principle that they're not a matter of the faith.
Sure. And that makes sense in terms of answering the question that is often posed by people who are commenting or by people who I speak, who gave the society the right or why does society think that they get to judge the Pope, judge the councils, and you don't get to do that. You are meant to be obedient.
Mm-hmm.
And this is the reason why. It's not that the society or Father Palko, Bishop Fillet, whomever thinks that they are better than the Pope. It is that there is a real problem, and by virtue of justice, we must stand up to it.
Yeah, and on account of faith, on account of the charity we owe to souls, any virtue that stands above that obedience sometimes has to take over, as it were, and we apparently disobey, not wanting to. I mean, it would be a lot easier if we could just obey, but we don't. And it could be said, obedience is not obedience if you're not going to obey when it's tough for you. It's different when I don't like it than when it impacts and harms my faith.
Sure.
And that's, it's not that we're objecting because we just don't like this Novus Ordo is kind of, it's kind of banal and stuck in the 60s and it's, et cetera. No, there is a matter of faith here, and it's not direct. And that's the problem. I guess we could apply this principle just briefly. And I'm sure with the various things, the episodes on the Novus Ordo, I don't want to go too deep into this because I'm sure it's been covered. But what does Cardinal Ottaviani in his letter at the beginning of the short critical study of the new rite of the Mass, the so-called Ottaviani intervention? He didn't write the study. It's actually people involved with the society and various other theologians and things like that Archbishop Lefebvre sort of worked to put together. But they presented this to a Cardinal Ottaviani, and he wrote a letter that begins this study. And he even says in his letter, it's not somebody putting words in his mouth, despite its brevity, this study shows quite clearly that the Novus Ordo Missae, considering the new elements widely susceptible to widely different interpretations, which are implied or taken for granted, represents both as a whole and in its details a striking departure from the Catholic theology of the Mass as formulated in session 22 of the Council of Trent. And he's basically using St. Thomas Aquinas and Archbishop Lefebvre's principle here. Right. The problem with this is you're diminishing the understanding of the Mass. That's effectively why we can't accept the Novus Ordo, why we don't use that missal, why we don't use that missal, whether we're ad orientem or not, or with lots of incense or not. It's something intrinsic to the rite itself. He continues and he says, the canons of the rite definitively fixed at Trent erected an insurmountable barrier against any heresy which might attack the integrity of the mystery. So, at the very least, we could say the Novus Ordo removes those barriers. What change? Well, you can change certain things as long as it helps the common good.
Right.
That doesn't. That undermines the common good, and it puts faith in danger. And we go through, and I just encourage people to read it. There's the Problem of Liturgical Reform that the Society has published. It's a study that we sent to the Pope about our objections. It says there's three major problems with the Novus Ordo. I don't want to duplicate what's been done in other podcasts here. So we've talked about that before in these things. Yes. Okay. Mm-hmm. So just overall, just as a high level summary here, the missal, the new rite of the Mass undermines the ministerial priesthood versus the priesthood of the faithful. So you're baptized, I presume.
Yep.
Okay, which is good.
Card carrying.
As a card-carrying baptized member of the Catholic Church, you have an intercessory power through that character of baptism to pray for poor Father Palko when he's preparing all of his notes for you, that he doesn't make horrible mistakes, right?
Yep.
So in a certain way, you're a go-between God and man, which is what a priest is. Certainly not the same kind of priest that I am, in the fact that I am a go-between on things like the Mass, for instance, the sacrificial aspect, my breviary, the prayers, things like that. So to confuse those two is precisely with all of the lay involvement in the various aspects of the Mass. Some various things changed in order to overemphasize the lay participation and the priesthood of the faithful, and confuse it and even reduce to a kind of presidency the ministerial priesthood. So, and we even get to the point with the various consecrations, the genuflection now missing before the consecration, and the showing of the host to everybody, admits of things like the Lutheran concept of consubstantiation and the presence of our Lord in the host by the faith of the people. Mm-hmm. It's a small little thing, but it can easily start, and all you need is a couple of sermons to explain that in a Lutheran way. And, unsuspecting Catholics might start believing that's how it is, right? So it's so ambiguous in those kinds of things that it confuses that. Obviously, the Mass is a sacrifice, a propitiatory sacrifice. And there are certain things in the general instruction, but also throughout the Mass, that turns it more into the Lord's Supper, which, there is a relation there. But in fact, the Mass is really Calvary. It's, the connection between the Mass and the Last Supper, the Lord's Supper, is Calvary. It's the crucifixion, which is in between those things. So you can't make that easily of a direct connection. And obviously, the new Mass tries to do that. The general instruction of the Roman Missal tries to define the Mass that way. I challenge anybody to read the 1969 original edition of the general instruction of the Roman Missal and the definition it has of the Mass, and come away and think that's very clearly Catholic. That's exactly what Trent was trying to say. So,
right.
And of course, there's a diminution of the respect and the belief in the real presence in the way that the rite ends up working out. So those things, since they've been covered in various different ways, I won't go into great detail on those. But I'll put it this way, because I was shocked, but I understand how it's put now. So there is a priest. He wasn't even a society priest, but when I was a bit younger, before I was a priest, who said, why we say this traditional Mass. He says, I don't say the Novus Ordo, because the Novus Ordo isn't a Catholic rite. And that was kind of a shocking thing to hear. Like, well, but it's promulgated by a pope. How's it not a Catholic rite? And clearly it makes our Lord present. It's valid. So what do you mean, Father? I was very kind of disturbed by this. And he said, I don't mean that it's not Catholic in the sense that Catholics aren't getting something out of it. But when you remove the explicitly Catholic things, it's so ambiguous and nebulous that it could be made Catholic or it could be made into anything. And I think that's the fundamental problem about the Novus Ordo and why we can't use that missal, is it could be anything. We could make it into almost anything. And that's not good liturgy. And that's not a good rite of the Mass. That's where it undermines faith and why we object to it, really fundamentally, I think.
Yeah. No, it's a great point. And it is a shocking thing for a priest to say. But I get the context in how he was saying it and how you're relating it too.
And I think that context is very important, because it's very easy to say something very shocking in order to it's a didactic tool, right? Mm-hmm. You come in. I remember, I think Father Thiemann used to do this too, and just imitation of him because he's a good teacher. I remember coming into an apologetics class that I was teaching in New Zealand and telling them, gentlemen, Father Palko doesn't believe in God, and after this class, you're not going to believe in God either. And my point was, then throughout the class, we talked about what belief is and how when you prove the existence of God through reasoning, you have science, you have a knowledge through causes, which means you can't have belief at that point in time unless you redefine what belief is. Belief is trusting on the authority of somebody else. When you've reasoned through it, you're not trusting somebody else, you're trusting the evidence that's in front of you. So it's a shocking statement in order to prompt something that's a very interesting conversation that will happen afterward, maybe something that will be memorable. So.
Right. You're doing clickbait in a classroom, which is great.
Exactly. It's clickbait before there was ever clicking. Socrates knew what he was doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And shoot, we've done that too. But like you said, the context is important. Understanding that you're not saying that the new Mass is invalid. You're not saying that it's not a Mass. You're saying all the Catholic parts of it are stripped away. So what can we say about it then?
It's a valid consecration that could be turned into almost anything. Catholic or otherwise. And it all then depends on the priest and the context and various other things. And therein lies the real problem. And that's why it's, amongst other things, why it has those three problems that we mentioned and has been talked about, and why we object to it. It's a matter of the faith, the principle that Archbishop Lefebvre and St. Thomas Aquinas were setting out for us.
Yeah. Let's look at some of the versions of the missals. Obviously, we've talked about that we use, that the society uses the 1962 missal. Why not some of the quote unquote transitional missals? Why not some of the updates before the new mass came about?
This was when I set out the notes. I figured that we'd start with the bigger topics and move backwards. And I'm just thinking now, it's sort of like Lent. You know how we come in boldly talking about St. John, and then we're sort of going backwards in time here.
Yeah.
You've noticed that with regard to Advent, like the Sundays talk more about John, and then now about Christ, and John sort of sending people off, and then it's like, there was this guy named John, and then he sort of recedes as somebody else increases, which is kind of touching. But so we're going backwards. We're kind of rewinding the clock here. So some people will talk about the 1965, and sometimes less about it, the 1967 missals. In fact, there are no such things. There are texts that are published during that time in the format of a missal, but these were all regional variations that the bishops' conferences of certain local areas published to incorporate the vernacular in certain parts of it, based off of changes that the concilium, and it was arguing Vatican II, wanted them to do. And so at no point in time throughout from 62 to 69 is there a typical edition. There are local editions, and these aren't meant to be permanent rights. They were meant as an interim towards some kind of solution, which ended up being the Novus Ordo. But really, actually, if you look at what Vatican II called for, I think if some of those fathers there said, "Oh, this is what we're going to get," they would not have seen that as a worthy product. But it's a different argument entirely. But so because these are local variations, and the society is an international society, why don't we just go back to the last international official edition? The rights are substantially the same. There's a few things taken out. And there's a fair argument to be made that some of these things were taken out in view of the Novus Ordo. But not all changes necessarily need to be seen in that light. And none of those changes, in fact, introduce something that undermine the faith per se. So it's not as if we couldn't use those. But at the beginning of the society, when we had different people, different priests saying different rites, we need to do something consistent throughout the society. And the only kind of common denominator is 1962.
Yeah, that is an argument I've heard before. Oh, but the SSPX used to use the 1965. Oh, but back then. So see, smoking gun.
Yeah, so I remember a picture, in fact, of the late Bishop T.C. de Mallory as subdeacon, vested in white at a cone, incensing at the elevation. Well, that was done because the subdeacon in 1965 didn't carry the paten. He left it on the the altar. So the subdeacon now is free, just like he is at a requiem mass, to incense. So he does that. So yes, it was being used, but as soon as the society sort of escaped the Francophile world, there was need to have a unified, and especially with regard to the problems in the United States during the early 80s, there had to be some kind of consistency there. So did the society use that? Sure. But it also wasn't very clear at the beginning of the society how long this Novus Ordo thing was going to last. And maybe we would go back to these traditional things. We had no idea of where we were going at that point in time. But I think it's really important that we go back to something consistent. That's a principled way of approaching this question, in fact.
Sure. What about some of the earlier missals, some of the earlier breviaries? I actually got a copy of a missal that was published just after 1570. And I showed it to one of our priests here locally, and he was like, "Oh, I wish I could say this." Okay, why not? Like, why couldn't you, Father Palko, say a 1960 version of the missal?
Well, you probably could. the issue would end up being, because the text is probably going to be mostly the same. Remember, there were changes, but it wasn't, horrifically, significant changes. There were a few words here and there. But we don't use those earlier ones for the same reason we mentioned there. We have to be obedient to the church, right? Those were authentically abrogated, overrided, and replaced. And that the church was doing that all the time. And the church did that up until 1962. We might like the earlier one, but again, it's not a matter of personal preference. A lot of cases, you can actually use the text from those missals. Pick up a missal, you scratch out and you fill in, the name of St. Joseph up there. I've seen plenty of missals where that's the case. When I go over to the Franciscan sisters here in Kansas City and I say Mass for them, they have a Franciscan missal with all of their saints in it from, I think, 54 or 55. Well, St. Joseph's name's not in there, and certain other feasts get moved around, and we have to. This was very common. You bought a very expensive book, and then you just kind of doctored it up, because it was expensive to buy the next one. So none of those changes that were made, even if we don't like them, and we'll leave aside Holy Week here because that's a big topic, and we're already kind of going quite long here. None of these changes put faith or morals in danger, right? We changed the classification of feasts to a simpler system. There's nothing that touches on the faith there.
Right.
We suppressed certain octaves and vigils. We even downgraded certain feasts. That may be lamentable, but it doesn't touch on the faith. I certainly like Our Lady of Mount Carmel. That's one of the chapels that I go and take care of. It was a major double, equivalent of a third-class feast. It's now a commemoration. But I can still say the Mass on that day. It doesn't call into question any Catholic doctrine to do that. It may be lamentable, but it's not a matter of the faith. And eliminating overlapping octaves like St. John the Baptist with St. Peter and Paul, oftentimes happening with the Sacred Heart and Corpus Christi all about the same time, is not a bad idea. I'll just put it that way. Again, it doesn't undermine any doctrine there. So that's why we don't use the earlier ones, because they have authentically been superseded. Legitimately, they are no longer the book that the church wanted us to use.
Yeah. There's also a common argument among some traditional Catholics that there are some rubrics that the Society of St. Pius X priests follow that are modernist, that have come around, that were made like in the 1960s, and they are problematic.
Mm-hmm. I think there's probably, I haven't heard too many of these arguments, but I don't see why that would, again, be modernist. It's a word that's bantered about more as a club to beat things we don't like with, rather than understanding. I don't know how vital immanence and agnosticism really enter into various rubrics of the Mass. So, these rubrics aren't Bugniniized or modernized or something like that. Though I think if you look at it, so John the 23rd issued a new set of rubrics in 1960. It's very clear from his document that he intended still a general liturgical reform to happen afterward. But he also seemed to intend that these rubrics were more or less going to be fixed and not changed significantly from there. And what suggests that is, remember that expensive book, right? Yeah. That they called a missal. It's like hundreds of dollars, and it's a pretty penny. And those breviaries, which are expensive too. If you're going to order that these rubrics, which change how you have to set these things up, be promulgated and new books be printed, you're not intending them, unless you really want to make some money off of them or something like that, that you're going to have another edition in 5 years. This isn't university. We don't have the new edition coming out every few years so the bookstore can make some money. It might have helped the Vatican Bank a little bit, but that wasn't the motive. We'll put it that way. So, certain things are changed here. And even Pius XII was already starting to do that well before his death. People argue at the end he was so sick he didn't really know what was going on. In 55, when he changed these things, he knew precisely what he was doing, and he simplified the calendar, and he simplified a lot of the rubrics. And John the 23rd is just following on there. It's the same people who are doing that. Here's the first step. We're going to modify the calendars, and clean it up a little bit. And then once we modify the calendar, here's the new rubrics. Finally, we can print the new breviaries, the new missal. And now, based off of that, they foresaw that Vatican II was supposed to then give principles for a few more changes that would happen over the next number of years. Obviously, it didn't do that. And the committee and Monsignor Bugnini took over at that point in time.
Right. But isn't there some logic to the idea that, well, these are all the same guys, same players. We're talking about at the span of 9 years, these changes that were made, some of them were made by Bugnini himself, some of them are made by John the 23rd, like you said, with an eye towards eventual changes with the concilium. Shouldn't we just reject all of those wholesale?
How do you solve a problem like Bugnini, right?
Yeah, right.
So he's an interesting character. There's been recently a biography by Yves Chiron, who did the biographies of Pius X and Pius IX, I believe, and a few others. I think even Angelus Press sells some of them. They're quite good. And he recently, in the last, I think 5 years ago or so, maybe even sooner, wrote a biography of Bugnini. And again, he's more involved in the Holy Week changes, and we'll discuss those later. But he was on the commission, the Commissio Piana, they call it, for the Piine from Pius XII, the Piine Commission, that suggested changes from 1948 up through 1962. And then he's involved with the Preparatory Commission in Vatican II, and then kind of gets himself booted. And then he becomes the chief architect of the Novus Ordo Mass, right? It's even rumored that he was a Freemason, and, et cetera. And that's, of course, traditional Catholics like to bring Bugnini up amongst these things in a very pejorative sense, and rightly so. The Novus Ordo is definitely his baby. And he nursed that into what it was. It clearly bears his signature. Even I remember reading of Archbishop Lefebvre having a conversation with Monsignor Bugnini at the time, or Father Bugnini at the time, and pointed out a few things, and he was just shocked at the response, like, "Oh, well, we never thought about that."
Oh, wow.
You didn't think about that?
Yeah.
How many years have been? So, it's often said that, the 1960 rubrics are Bugnini's, that the Holy Week revision is Bugnini's. He sort of ends up being the scapegoat for anything we don't like, or all liturgical changes. And so everything must, if he's touched it, it must be tainted. This is the fallacy of the poisoning of the well, right?
Right.
It's a red herring, but we ought to talk about that. It's a short amount of time, and why is it a red herring? The question isn't who, the question is what. Who made the changes doesn't really matter, right? What are those changes? Are they legitimate? And in fact, it seems like his influence is wildly overstated, in fact, at least before Vatican II. But let's presume the worst, that he was, behind all of these things in view of the Novus Ordo. Okay. That he had an intimate role in those changes. Let's assume he was a Freemason and bent on the destruction of the liturgy. Let's assume that for the moment. That's not an argument against any of the changes. Evil people can do good things. They can also do evil things too, but people with evil intentions don't always get their way. And evil people sometimes lie about what they're doing too.
Yeah.
And the question about Freemasonry and the degree of influence, actually, those are historical, very important questions, but they're not theologically or liturgically any matter. And even people who will argue for, say, like the 1954 edition of Holy Week, readily admit that they're not. These aren't Bugniniized, as it were. The real question ends up being what we've been talking about. Does this change impact our faith? Do they diminish the clarity of the Catholic doctrine being presented? And so I would encourage highly the reading of that book, Annibale Bugnini, Reformer of the Liturgy by Chiron. It's very good. Also, recently published is the memoirs of Cardinal Federico Antonelli, who was sort of Bugnini's a thorn in Bugnini's side, and sometimes his enemy, sometimes his compatriot. Really interesting figure. So Bugnini, by the time he is appointed to as secretary of the Commissio Piana, is only 12 years a priest. He's quite young. As a secretary of that commission, all he's doing is organizing. And in fact, that's what he was actually well known for. He was very good at organizing things. So good that later along, when he implements that during the time of the concilium, and they were writing the Novus Ordo Missae and constructing that, he's playing one group off of the other very well. He certainly would not have been able to do that quite as well in this papal commission back in 1948. And there's good reasons to think that. Firstly, usually the prefect in this, at that time, a cardinal or archbishop, was the one who went to the Pope. So Bugnini wouldn't have had any access to Pius XII through this commission. And it only had 6 members. He was one of 6, and everybody else outranked him. He was the low man on the totem pole, and he was just the guy who was supposed to be keeping the notes and sending out the messages, etc. He's later obviously going to become infamous on his work in the concilium, but in fact, the problem, I think, is before any of these biographies came out, before the memoirs of Cardinal Antonelli comes out more recently, Bugnini himself wrote a great long work called La Riforma Liturgica. And this is often quoted because in there, he makes sweeping grand claims. He just kind of talks himself up about he was the mover and shaker and he did all of these things. And that's where a lot of the ideas that he was behind these things comes from, in fact. He's the only one that claims that, by the way.
I see.
And even, Michael Davies suggests certain things there, but finally, when we get Cardinal Antonelli's memoirs, it's pretty clear that he had very little to do with these things. Yes, he was there. He gave some ideas, but it wasn't until really about the time of Vatican II that some of his ideas start, getting some red flags waved at them. But a lot of people claim that and season that claim that he did so many things, and they'll reject the 1962 Missal, for instance. Oh, it was touched by Bugnini. It doesn't seem like he was actually much involved there other than as a secretary. And the real reason that a lot of those people don't like the 1962 Missal isn't about Bugnini at all. It's about John XXIII, their sedevacantist. It's not a valid. It's not a validly promulgated Missal. In any case, Bugnini is either a liar or just misrepresents himself heavily. Right. We'll put it that way.
He was a guy who was in the room when it happened, but he wasn't the mover and shaker of these earlier things that took place.
Absolutely. And I'll just give you a little information here too. So it's said that he had some very liberal liturgical ideas and finally came on right before Vatican II started on the radar of John the 23rd. And as a result of those, he was kicked off this preparatory commission. He was demoted from his teaching position. It should have been a career-ending move at that point in time. And some people think that that's when he perhaps got into cahoots with the Freemasons to kind of get reintroduced through some channels that they had. There's no proof of that. There's nothing to suggest that didn't happen either. And there are certain connections there. There are certain claims. Even Chiron in his biography says, well, we can't really prove this. It could have been true. It might not have been true. But the real reason he actually was kicked off the commission was his organizational skills. So all of these changes that they wanted in the schema for the liturgy, Sacrosanctum Concilium, he and some other liberal members were pushing them. And the head of the commission, Cardinal Gaetano Cicognani, I think it is. Anyway, he was unwilling to sign off on these things. So Bugnini went to his brother, who was the Cardinal Secretary of State, to sort of cajole him. They were very different, in fact, very, very different characters. Cardinal Gaetano was quite conservative, in fact, and he was not going to have a whole lot of these things. So, but he goes to the cardinal's brother, and the brother has a conversation, and then sort of they are forced into a signature on this, and then soon afterward he's fired. So, I have a feeling that his mode of operating sort of got up to the higher channels and thought, yeah, we can't have this guy around. Yeah. In any case, that would have normally been career ending. But later he gets in, and now he has certainly bad principles at that point in time. Anyway, Cardinal Antonelli, you mentioned him. He was the prefect of the Congregation of Rites. So he had an inside, scoop on this as well. He says that basically, if you look through there, Bugnini played no major role up until about 64. So, and the best modern scholarship suggests that might have been, like I said, when the Masonic influence comes in, circumstantial evidence, rumors, etc. So obviously he was influential in Novus Ordo Missae, but when it comes to the things earlier, there's just certainly no solid proof that he had anything to do with these changes. So again, it's a question of not who, but what. So why does the society use the 1962 Missal? Because, well, it's been touched by Bugnini. He was on the commission. It's not a question of who. It's a question of what. Are any of these changes matters of the faith? And they're just simply not. And so we have an obligation to accept, even if we don't like it, even if we have our own preferences, we have an obligation to accept those things that the Holy See has promulgated. And that was the last one before the Novus Ordo, which obviously we can't accept.
Fair enough. There are, to play devil's advocate again a little bit, there are some changes, or there are some adaptations, variations to the Missal that the society does do. Mm-hmm. And again, variations from the 1962. So, Father Palko, we've been sitting here talking for the last hour 15, hour 20, and you're saying, hey, we got to stick to the 62, got to stick to this. Well, but there are some things that society priests do that aren't actually in the 1962 Missal. What's up?
Well, yes and no. Okay. They're not there, but okay. So here's how to look at this. There are three ways that you can act. You can act in accordance with the law. We call it secundum legem. You can act against the law, illegally, contra legem, or explicitly violating some command. You can also act praeter legem, which means outside of the law. The law doesn't command, the law doesn't forbid, it allows, widely speaking, but it doesn't command. So again, going back, we mentioned that the Roman liturgy always had local variations at times. And we've mentioned when we did the rubrics podcast before that there was this whole congregation, the Sacred Congregation of Rites, that existed to solve the problems when these things kind of got out of hand. And that was even going on after Quo Primum, after things were sort of brought back into the Holy See's hands. So they would either forbid a practice if they saw that it was against the law. They would forbid it from being introduced, but allowing it to be tolerated and then permanently eliminated for a time. They would tolerate practices, or sometimes they would permit them. Normally speaking, their way of operating was, if something was according to the law, certainly fine. If it was against the law, it should be eliminated as long as it wasn't going to cause scandal and as quickly as possible. If it was outside the law, as long as it wasn't going to cause confusion, it could be allowed. So I'll give you an example of one of these things that we in the society, and basically everybody else who uses the 1962 Missal does. Okay. The second Confiteor, or actually the third Confiteor, because there's one beforehand, but the one that's right before communion. So in the revision of the rubrics by John the 23rd, number 503 says that the Confiteor is omitted when communion is distributed in Mass. So what happened was the communion rite is brought out of the ritual and put into Mass. It starts with the Confiteor. We said the Confiteor. But now they're saying, well, you've already said one at the beginning of Mass. just if you're going to do this during Mass, don't do this. But the way it's worded, it doesn't forbid the use. It just instructs that something that was customary beforehand be omitted. So if you keep something that now is omitted, you're acting praeter legem, outside of the law. Keeping a custom that is not explicitly forbidden is something that could be allowed. It certainly would be something that, if you look at how the SRC acts, would have been tolerated at the very least. And in fact, it's not as easy as just looking at number 503 in the in the rubrics either, because the 1962 pontifical disagrees with the 1960 rubrics. In fact,
of course.
So 503 says Confiteor is omitted before communion. In the ordination masses, the pontifical says it is said before communion. And this is a revision to the pontifical. So it's not like it's just an older version. It's 1962 revised pontifical says it's used here. The 1956 edition of Holy Week, the changes there, says that the Confiteor before Holy Communion is omitted. It instructs that it be omitted. The 1962 Missal removes that. So it's gone. So it was instructed that it must be omitted, and now in 1962, it's gone. Probably because they said, well, we have a rubric now, but it's now outside of the specific thing. And in fact, oddly enough, we say the 1956 version of the OHS because that was the OHS that's available. We'll talk about that next time, I think. So we omit it on Holy Thursday. So we follow the books that are in front of us because it says to omit it in that case. But when we say Mass, no. And in fact, that edition, while it says to omit it on Thursday, Holy Thursday, requires it on Good Friday before communion.
Yeah.
And beyond that, there were questions that were given to the Ecclesi Dei Commission. Not that we're too concerned about that, but basically everybody who has ever used the 1962 Fraternity of St. Peter, the Institute of Christ the King, ourselves, independent priests, diocesan priests, everybody has kept this. Cardinals have kept it when they said that. And in fact, in 2018, right before it was dissolved, the Pontifical Commission, Ecclesi Dei, said, if you're already doing this, just keep it. So those are the kinds of things that we do have certain variations, but every time you see one of these variations, it isn't an explicit violation of a law. It's the keeping of a custom where it's not forbidden. Okay. Because again, the principle is obedience.
Yeah. This reminds me a lot of I don't remember which episode it was, but we were talking about, it was the liturgical music episode that you and I did in this series. And you were talking about how realistically, there are not supposed to be women in choirs. However, where local custom is already doing it and where it would cause a disturbance, like you said, to change a law is going to cause more of an issue. Okay, let it keep going. But is it sort of the same thing here where it's like, it's not contrary to the law. Keep it going, keep the custom going. It's fine.
Right. And the other thing, too, is to look at what was done. Did people in 1960, when this rubric was promulgated, did they start leaving off the Confiteor? In most places, no. Yeah. Now, they just kept what they were doing because it wasn't against the law. It was praeter legem. And I think if you look at the other little variations, you'll see they're all like that. I mean, how many times do you ring the bell? Well, there are books that suggest certain things. There are liturgists, but it's not in the rubrics. Right. So, I mean, there are right answers and wrong answers on that too. But should we start arguing over that? I don't think it's the most important thing when we have a church in such crisis. Put it that way.
Right. Exactly.
So, but then there's Holy Week.
Yeah, I was just going to say, so to kind of wrap up, we've got Holy Week, and I know, again, we're going to be doing that next week or next episode. But
and I would say that's probably one of the reasons why I suggested we break this up. A lot of these principles and why we use 1962 will come into the fore. So hopefully this gives a kind of primer for some of the things we'll talk about and means we don't have to spend 3 or 4 hours talking about Holy Week.
Okay.
I think you would rather that and not do that. And I would certainly rather not spend an entire afternoon recording that for you. Yeah, interesting absolutely. As it is.
No, yeah, so. It's fascinating. And there are liturgical nerds out there who would love it. However, for the purposes of this series,
there's a lot of other work that I have to get done. So
yeah, exactly.
Very good.
All right. So, Father, we'll hold it from there.
Okay.
Talk to you next week. Thank you so much for this. It was very helpful.
My pleasure. God bless.
You too.